Okay, so first off, let's answer this question here. What happens when you load up a website? Because that's the first thing that people don't really know too well. They type in search terms in Google, they type in domain names in the search bar, but what actually happens when you load up a website? So to answer this, what we need to know is how does the internet work, basically. So the client server model is the most basic explanation of what the internet is. It's just a connection, a network that bridges between servers and clients, both of which are computers. They're all computers, but they are servers and clients. And you can see a diagram of this is what it kind of represents. You have one server containing information, containing websites, containing files that make up websites, containing databases with data, and this is what a server farm would look like. It's just a huge place full of computers that just work all day processing data and processing requests from these clients. Clients being other computers used by you and me that we can call up websites from. And that's what the internet basically is. It's just the connection between one computer to another, and the sharing of data and the requesting and responding of data back and forth. And it's all made up of computers. This server farm is made up of computers. This is a computer. This is a client computer. This is a server computer. They're all computers. They're just they're the same basic thing, but they do different jobs and they're connected, and together they make up the World Wide Web. So this is a slightly more in detailed explanation of how it actually works when you load up a website. So the first thing that happens when you just type in a domain name in the URL, this is kind of just, it's not too important to know, but it's quite interesting. So you just, when you put just a domain name like this, turnonvpn.org, it's going to send that request to something called a DNS server, called a domain name system server. And there are not that many of these servers, although they have the same kind of function as a server that we saw here. This could be a DNS server, it could not be. They're all computers. But they have a different function. The function of a DNS server is to connect up the IP address to a domain name, because each domain name, and a domain name just means the name of a website that will start with something like www and will end with .org or .com or .net. That's a domain name. And each domain name, when someone buys a domain name, will have an IP address. And that IP address corresponds to some server somewhere that has that specific IP address with the files of the website on it. But the DNS server isn't involved with that. The DNS server just has a huge list of all the domain names of a certain region, and then a huge list of all the corresponding IP addresses. So the first thing that you do, you type in the domain name, it will send a request to a DNS server, and the DNS server will reply with the IP address corresponding to the domain name that you put in. And then the browser will now interpret that IP address and then make an HTTP request, a hypertext transfer protocol request, to the server of that specific IP address. And which is just this long number that you might have seen before, these long numbers with periods in the middle. That's just an IP address. And then the server will reply with all the needed files so that the website can render out onto the screen, and then the user can use it. And then when the user puts in some information into the site, it will make another HTTP request down to the server, and it will put data into this server itself, into the database. So it's just this back and forth of HTTP requests and responses between the server with all the files of the website that we're going to be learning how to make, that are stored on this specific IP address server, somewhere in a big server farm, exactly like what we saw earlier. These servers are stored, just one of these little stacks here, that's a server. And you send this HTTP request to there, and then that will reply. And you might be wondering why you have the DNS server if this seems to be working so well. And that's because machines are just much better at interpreting numbers than names and words. So that's why it's needed to have an IP address, an Internet Protocol address instead of just a name, because machines wouldn't be able to recognize so fast domain names and calculate them as easily as a number. So, for example, Twitter, which you probably know about, the website twitter.com, this is one of the IP addresses it has. Obviously, Twitter is a huge website, so it has more than one server, but this is one of them. So if you look up for this IP address here, you should get twitter.com coming back in the same exact way that you would do it for any other website. So here is just a chronological order of what would happen when you actually load up a website. So this is just what we said. So the user types in a URL, including the domain name, so such as twitter.com. The browser sends a request to the DNS server, and it's called a DNS lookup. You might have heard that. Oops. You might have heard that term. Okay, a DNS lookup, domain name system lookup. Then the DNS server will respond with that IP address corresponding to the website in question. And then the browser will send an HTTP request to that to the server with that IP address, and then they will go back and forth with HTTP requests to do whatever the user wants to do on that site. But the first HTTP request is going to just send the files that are needed to render out the site on the browser. And then the browser interprets all those files, the HTML, the CSS, the styling, all the interactive stuff, and it renders it out. Exactly like here, I'm on Google Drive here. Google Drive is a website, and I did exactly what all of these steps here. So then the website is rendered out on my computer. Okay, so that's the basis of how the internet works. But now you might be wondering the actual components of a website itself. Because if you remember what I told you, the first HTTP request is from this server here, the server with the specific IP address. And that's the first HTTP response, sending back the files. And the files are just the components of a website. So you can see this diagram here to explain. It's quite a complicated, weird diagram, but it explains it quite well, what makes up a website. And you can see that there are two main sections in this diagram, the client side and the server side. And if you remember, I was talking earlier about the client-server model. This is exactly what it is. This is what the internet is. On the server, you have these elements of a website. And on the client, you have these elements of the website. So on the client side, you have the HTML, so the actual content of the site. Then you have the CSS, the styling of the site, what makes it look good. Then the JS, the JavaScript, and that's what allows users to interact with the site in a cool way. So those are all the files that get sent to the client from the server, from the web server. And then on the server side, you have a different stack of elements. You have the web server itself, and that's the server that just contains all the different files in a certain location on the computer that is the server. And it has a specific IP address so that the client can find it. Then you have the backend language, and the backend language will talk between the database and the server, so that then the server can take elements from the database, can take data from the database and display it on the client, and the client can then interact with the database through this backend language. So let's say a user can put in a username in the client side, the backend language will interpret that username and store it in the database. And then we get to the database, and that's one of the most important parts on a website. That's where all the data is stored. And all of these three things are stored in one of those big computers that you saw earlier in the server farm. While these elements here, these are sent to the client computer, just a small laptop or a desktop just owned by someone like you or me. And that's how it works. That's how a website works. And then around here you can see all the different technologies that people use to make their lives easier. And so you can see all the different types of databases that you can have. You know, MySQL, Redis, all these different things, different backend languages, and all these different little libraries. So if you want to know, I'm gonna teach you how to use mainly PHP as the backend language, MySQL as the database, Apache as the web server, and then jQuery for JavaScript, and we won't worry about Bootstrap for HTML and CSS. So those are the libraries that we're going to use if you want to note those down. But really, the more and more you learn about this stuff, the more you realize that the technology that you use does not matter. It's more about just the thinking process and getting your mind around how to solve problems while making a site. So once you understand how it works, the technology really doesn't matter.